I moved into my new apartment complex during the fall, just as the leaves were turning that burned orange hue. It was a small, quiet place, nothing fancy, but it suited me. My unit was on the 3rd floor, right across from apartment 304. The building itself had an old, musty scent, like it had been standing for decades without any real upkeep. The hallways were dimly lit, and some of the lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The first time I noticed something off was during my second night. I was coming back from a late shift when I saw my neighbor standing in his doorway staring at me. He was an older man, thin, with hollowed-out eyes that seemed to swallow the light. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there as if frozen in place. I nodded a polite hello, but he didn't react. Over the next few weeks, I heard strange noises from 304, low murmurs in the dead of night, scraping sounds against the floor. Once, I heard what sounded like nails dragging across my front door. I called management, but they assured me that the tenant in 304 was harmless. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A slow, deliberate knock 3 times. The sound was unnervingly soft, almost like someone was tapping with their fingernails. I crept to my peephole and peered through. My neighbor was standing there, but his face was too close, so close that I could only see his eye. It was wide open, bloodshot, unblinking. I recoiled, backing away from the door, heart pounding. The next morning, told the landlord about it, but she looked at me strangely. Apartment 304 has been empty for months, she said. I didn't believe her. That night, I heard the knocking again this time. It came from inside my apartment. I shot upright in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking was impossibly close, just beyond my bedroom door. My mind raced. Had I forgotten to lock the front door? Was someone inside my apartment? I reached for my phone, but my hands were trembling so badly, I nearly dropped it. The screen illuminated my dark bedroom, casting eerie shadows along the walls. It was 3:04 a.m. The knocking came again, 3 soft taps, then silence. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay put. Crept toward my bedroom door, my heart hammering so loudly I swore whoever was out there could hear it. My fingers barely brushed the doorknob when I heard it, breathing, shallow, raspy breathing, just inches from where I stood. I pressed my ear against the wood, trying to make sense of what was happening. Hate, voice whispered, then an almost playful murmured, "My name, Daniel." I stumbled backward, my throat clenching in terror. I hadn't told my neighbor my name. My mind screamed for me to call the police, but before I could react, the breathing stopped. The silence was suffocating. Slowly, I reached for the doorknob again, hesitating for only a second before yanking the door open. The hallway was empty. I checked every inch of my apartment, my pulse racing. The front door was locked. The windows were latched. There's no sign of forced entry. And yet, I knew someone had been in here. Someone had whispered my name. Sleep was out of the question. I sat on my couch with every light on, gripping a kitchen knife like it was my last lifeline. The night dragged on, agonizingly slow, until the first rays of sunlight finally bled through my curtains. I called the landlord again that morning, demanding answers. She sighed heavily, as if she had been expecting this call. "Mr. Daniel, I told you already. No one has lived in 304 for a long time." Not since. She hesitated. "Since what?" I pressed. A long pause. Then, in a hushed tone, she said, "Since the last tenant disappeared." My blood ran cold. Disappeared? He was troubled. Kept saying he heard things, saw things in the apartment. Then one day, he just vanished, left everything behind. The police never found him. A heavy silence stretched between us. "Do yourself a favor," she said finally. "Stay away from 304. That night, I couldn't resist. I had to know the truth. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I made my way across the hallway. Door to 304 was locked, but the landlord had given me just enough doubt to push forward. With a deep breath, I jammed the crowbar between the door and the frame, prying it open with a sharp crack. The apartment was wrong. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, undisturbed for what looked like years. The furniture was outdated, the wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. But what sent my stomach into freefall were the photographs, hundreds of them scattered across the floor, pinned to the walls, covering every inch of the tiny space. And they were all of me. I staggered backward, my flashlight trembling. Some photos were from months ago, me at work, me walking home, me in my apartment. But the worst ones, they were from last night, me asleep in my bed, a shadowy figure standing just beside me. My breath hitched as a creaking sound echoed from deeper in the apartment. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light. And then I saw him, the man from the doorway, his skeletal frame hunched in the farthest corner, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. A grotesque grin split his face, stretching too wide, as if his skin was barely containing something underneath. Then, that same raspy, sing-song voice, he whispered, "Daniel," I ran. I don't remember getting back to my apartment. I don't remember locking the door, but I do remember the knocking. 3 soft taps. Then his voice muffled through the wood. "You let me in." I moved out the next day. When I moved into my suburban home, I was relieved to finally have a place to myself. The neighborhood was peaceful, and everyone seemed friendly, especially the woman next door, Mrs. Langley. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, but she carried herself with a youthful energy. Her bright blue eyes always seemed alight with excitement, and she had the kind of perfect posture that made her presence oddly imposing. And then was her smile. At first, I thought she was just a sweet old lady. She would wave enthusiastically whenever I came home, offer me cookies she had just baked, or ask me about my day. But there was something off about her smile. Never faltered. It was too wide, too fixed, as if it had been carved onto her face. Her teeth were always perfectly lined, gleaming in the daylight, but they never quite seemed to move when she talked. It was like her lips had forgotten how to form any other expression. It wasn't until the first night in my new home that I started to feel truly uneasy about her. I was unpacking boxes when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Through my kitchen window, I saw Mrs. Langley standing in her front yard, facing my house. She was staring directly at me. Her body was rigid, arms hanging stiffly at her sides, and her head was slightly tilted. And, of course, she was smiling. At first, I figured she had just been outside for a walk or tending to her flowers, but as the minutes dragged on, she didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I decided to ignore it and pulled down the blinds, forcing myself to focus on unpacking. But the strange feeling in my gut wouldn't leave. The next few days were more of the same. Every time I left for work, she was there standing by her window, watching. Every time I returned, she was still there, waiting. She never waved, never called out to me like she had before, just smiled. Then things escalated. One evening, I was taking out the trash when I noticed her standing at the edge of my driveway. I gave her a nod, expecting her usual greeting, but this time, she didn't wave back. She just stared. Her smile remained, but her eyes were different. They were vacant, almost hollow, like she wasn't really there, like she was just a shell of a person. I hurried back inside and locked the door. I told myself she was just an eccentric old lady, harmless and lonely, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, I woke up to a noise outside my bedroom window, a slow, deliberate tapping. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, staring at the curtains. The tapping continued, rhythmic and patient. Swallowing hard, I crept toward the window and, with a deep breath, pulled the curtains aside. Mrs. Langley was standing in her yard, her face tilted up toward my bedroom, her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto mine, her mouth stretched in that same unnatural grin. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some friendly old lady being overly neighborly. This was something. I barely slept that night, and in the morning, I made sure to lock every door and window in the house before heading to work. But when I returned that evening, something was off. The front door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. I hesitated before pushing it open, my fingers gripping the doorknob tightly. The air inside was heavy, thick with an odd floral scent that hadn't been there before. I stepped in cautiously, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but something felt wrong. I checked the windows, still locked. The back door still locked. My bedroom, nothing disturbed. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. The next few nights, I became obsessive. I double-checked every lock, installed extra deadbolts, and even placed a chair under the doorknob before going to bed. But every morning, I would wake to find the front door slightly open. It's just an inch, as if someone had tried to come inside, but stopped at the last second. I couldn't take it anymore. I installed security cameras around the house, desperate for answers. I needed to know what was happening while I slept. That night, I barely closed my eyes, my mind racing with possibilities. When morning came, I immediately checked the footage. At exactly 3:14 a.m., Mrs. Langley appeared on my porch. I watched in horror as she reached for my doorknob and, without hesitation, twisted it open. But instead of stepping inside immediately, she just stood there, her head tilting slowly to the side. Then, she took a single step forward into my home. For the next 3 hours, she stood in my living room, completely still, smiling. She didn't move, she didn't wonder. She just stood there, as if waiting for something. Then, moments before sunrise, she turned around and walked out, closing the door behind her. I slammed the laptop shut, my entire body trembling. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some sleepwalking old woman. This was deliberate, calculated. The police didn't take me seriously. They said she was probably confused, maybe dealing with dementia. They spoke to her, and she acted completely normal, sweet, kind, harmless. They told me there was nothing they could do unless she actually committed a crime. But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room, every light on, a baseball bat clutched in my hands, and sure enough, at 3:14 a.m., there was a soft creak outside my door. Then, the knob turned. I held my breath as the door slowly opened. Mrs. Langley stepped inside, moving with unnatural smoothness. Her head turned toward me, her wide smile never faltering. But this time, she spoke. "You let me in?" she whispered. I didn't think. I bolted out the back door, sprinting to my car. I drove away that night and never returned. I had the house put up for sale, and within a few weeks, I was gone. But sometimes, late at night, I see her in my dreams, standing outside my window, smiling. When I moved into my new apartment, I was just happy to finally have a place of my own. It wasn't anything fancy small, a bit outdated, with creaky floors and thin walls, but it was mine. The landlord had warned me that the ventilation system was old and sometimes sounds carried through the vents in odd ways. I didn't think much of it at first. That changed my first night there as I was settling into bed. I heard a noise, soft, rhythmic, scratching, coming from the ceiling vent above me. It was faint, like nails lightly dragging across metal. I figured it was just the old system acting up, but the sound didn't stop. It went on for hours. At some point, I got up and stood on my bed to take a closer look. The vent cover was screwed in tightly, but something about it made me uneasy. The darkness beyond the slats seemed too deep, like it was swallowing the light from my bedroom. Then, just as I was about to step down, I heard it, a whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was faint, barely audible, but I was certain I heard it. "You can hear me, can't you?" I jumped back, nearly falling off my bed. My mind raced. It had to be the vents, carrying a neighbor's voice from another apartment, right? I tried to shake it off, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next few days, the scratching continued. But now, it wasn't just scratching. I started hearing breathing shallow, ragged breathing, just above my bed at night. When everything was silent, I swore I could hear it moving. One evening, I was in the kitchen when I noticed something strange. The vent in the ceiling, just above the fridge, was slightly ajar. Not much, just enough that I could see a sliver of darkness behind it. My stomach churned as I stepped closer. That's when I smelled a rancid, sour odor. Like decaying flesh, something was in the vents. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made my skin crawl. Around 3 a.m., I heard something new, a soft thud above my ceiling, followed by the slow, methodical sound of metal bending. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the vent above my bed. And then I saw them. Bony fingers curled around the edges of the vent slats, gripping the metal like someone or something was watching me from inside. I shot up in bed, heart hammering as I scrambled for my phone. But by the time I looked back, the fingers were gone. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I called the landlord. He seemed unfazed. "That unit's been empty for a while," he said, referring to the apartment above me. "Might be rats in the vents. Send someone to check it out." Rats. That's what they always say. That night, I locked my bedroom door and slept with the lights on. But around 2:30 a.m., woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. A click, the unmistakable sound of my closet door unlatching. I lay frozen, my body refusing to move as the door creaked open, inch by inch. My breath hitched as I reached for my phone, fumbling with shaky fingers to turn on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the darkness, revealing the empty closet, or so I thought. Then I looked up. The vent in my closet had been pushed open, and hanging from it, gripping the edge with long, spindly fingers, was a face, gaunt, hollow eyes, a grin stretched too wide, skin pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. I barely had time to react before the thing scurried back into the darkness, moving impossibly fast. I stumbled out of my room, slamming the door behind me, heart threatening to burst from my chest. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of forced entry, no sign of anything out of place, except for the open vent. Determined to get proof, I set up a camera facing my closet that night, keeping all the lights on and forcing myself to stay awake as long as I could. At some point, must have dozed off because I woke up to a sharp, metallic creak. The closet vent cover was hanging loose. I forced myself to stay still, my heart slamming against my ribs. Something was in there, watching, waiting. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The second the sun rose, I grabbed my camera and checked the footage. Around 3:14 a.m., the vent cover in my closet began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it slid open. Then, something emerged, a hand, thin and bony, grasping the edges. And then, a face. It just stared at me as I slept, unmoving, its head tilting slightly, that unnatural grin widening. It stayed there for nearly an hour before retreating back into the vents. That was all I needed. Spocked my things and left that morning, breaking my lease and never looking back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still wake up, hearing scratching in the walls,